Well, I'd like to introduce our main speaker tonight, Randy Atwood. I asked Randy to send me a little bit of an introduction for him, and I'm going to just read this, what Randy sent to me. It says, 2019 marked the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. There was much coverage around the July 20th date, but perhaps there were some aspects of the mission that you may not have heard before. For instance, what changes were made to the Lunar Module while it stood on the launch pad as a result of issues found during the Apollo 10 mission in May? Why was there nearly no television from the moon during the Moonwalk? Why was Armstrong chosen to take the first steps on the moon? Why are there no good pictures of Armstrong standing on the lunar surface? It's fake. What 5 problems did Armstrong and Aldrin face during the landing, each of which, if not resolved by the crew and mission control, could have meant no lunar landing, or worse? G. Randy Atwood is a resident of Mississauga and has been looking up at the night sky for nearly 50 years. He joined the RASC in 1970. He is the founder, past president, and currently honorary president of the Mississauga Centre, a past president of the Toronto Centre, and a past president of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. He was the executive director of the Society and publisher of Sky News from 2014 to 2019. In 2013, he was named as one of the first fellows of the Society. In 2005, he was awarded the Society's Service Award. Randy has appeared on CTV, CBC, Global, and the Discovery Channel to provide background information for space and astronomy-related stories. He has covered 12 space shuttle launches and landings as a journalist, as a Canadian Space Agency photographer. Between 1981 and 1994, he produced and hosted 63 astronomy cable television shows called Astronomy Toronto, which are stored on the Society's RASC Canada YouTube channel. He has traveled to various places around the world to observe and photograph 12 total eclipses of the sun. He has written high school astronomy textbook units on astronomy and presented planetarium programming at schools. Randy Atwood is the president of the Earthshine Astronomy and Space Science Organization, a Mississauga group based on a not-for-profit charity organization. Earthshine hopes to build and run a public observatory facility in the Mississauga area. In 2012, asteroid 260235 was renamed Asteroid Atwood in his honor. I'm hoping everyone will give Randy a round of applause as he comes up. I'd like to introduce our first speaker tonight, Randy Atwood.
All right, well, thanks very much. That says Hamilton. It shouldn't say Hamilton. What is that? Anyway, this is Kitchener. This is the presentation from last night. So I'm very pleased to be here. I've been meaning to come to a Kitchener-Waterloo Centre meeting for quite a while, and so finally have the opportunity to talk to you about a topic that I'm very interested in, and that is the Apollo 11, the Apollo program. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about, as Steve said, some of the things that you may not know about Apollo 11, given all of the programs, just documentaries, specials that took place over the summer of the 50th anniversary. There are a few things that you may not have known, and I want to address them tonight. But there are other things that, there are so many things that I couldn't get them all into one talk. So just to give you an idea that there's stuff out there that's maybe being, well, since they never landed anyway, there could be a lot of things you don't know, right? All right. So the first thing is probably the one that you're most interested in, is why was Armstrong chosen to walk, to be the first? And you would think that if you were planning to run an 8-year, $25 billion in 60s money program, this would be a big deal. And you'd sit down, you'd have a big committee of government and whatever, and they'd sort of look at all these different people, and they'd choose one person to be the first on the moon. Unfortunately, that's not how it happened. But first I want to talk to you about a friend of mine who I got to know in the 90s, Owen Maynard, who was a Canadian, born in Sarnia, flew mosquitoes in Europe during World War II, worked on the Avro Arrow, was an aeronautical engineer, and was one of the 33 people hired by Bob Gilruth and NASA in 1959. I think it was, when the Avro Arrow project was canceled. So they were looking for people, and they came up, Bob Gilruth actually came up to Toronto and interviewed many of the Avro engineers. And Owen was one of the people who was hired. So Owen worked on the Mercury program and moved right into the Apollo program and developed essentially the plan on how to get to the moon. And what he did is he came up with 7 missions that they would need to fly to get 2 astronauts on the moon. The first 2 would be unmanned flights of the big Saturn V and the Command Service Module and the Lunar Module, and then there would be 5 manned missions of various complexities, some in Earth orbit, some in lunar orbit. So those were pretty well laid out in the 66, 67 time frame. But the person who really decided who was going to fly and who was going to fly with whom was Deke Slayton. Deke was a Mercury astronaut. He was actually scheduled to fly right after John Glenn, but doctors found a heart murmur that grounded him. And so the other astronauts essentially made him the chief astronaut, and from then all the way through the early shuttle program, he was the fellow who decided who flew and who with whom. And in fact, that's a picture I took of Deke at one of the early space shuttle press conferences. So even in the early shuttle days, he was choosing who would fly on a U.S. spacecraft. So there was a meeting of Deke and the 7 first group astronauts and the 9 second group astronauts. And the story goes that he got them all into one room. They're all looking nice in their suits and ties there. And he closed the door, and he essentially said, someone in this room is going to be the first person to walk on the moon. And from then on, they went and flew the Gemini flights, and they flew Apollo flights. But he is the guy that made the decision. So after some of the 2 of the unmanned flights, the first flight of Apollo was in October 1968, just 11 days in Earth orbit to check out the Command and Service Module, essentially the mothership. Around this time, the plan was that after Apollo 7 would be Apollo 8, and that would be a mission with the prime crew of McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert, and they would fly a command module, and it would be the first flight of the Lunar Module in Earth orbit. After that, Apollo 9, with the crew of Borman, Collins, and Anders, they would fly the same Command Service Module and Lunar Module, but in a higher orbit, like a 40,000 mile elliptical orbit. And then the mission after that would go to the moon, but not land on the moon. It would go into orbit around the moon, and then the landing attempt would fall on the mission after that. So the way it worked was that a prime crew would fly, it would have a backup crew. The backup crew would essentially train, and they'd be ready to jump into the prime crew's place if necessary. But otherwise, they would skip 2 missions and be put into the prime crew position on the 3rd mission after that flight. So in this case, for Apollo 8, the prime crew was McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert. The backup was Conrad, Bean, and Gordon. They would jump 2 missions and normally be placed on this mission, this G mission, which at that point would be Apollo 11. So at this point in time, in the summer of '68, Conrad's crew was essentially positioned to get the first attempt at the landing. So this was the original Apollo 9 crew. You recognize Frank Borman and Bill Anders there, and you may recognize Michael Collins there in the middle. He was actually on the Apollo 9 crew for a short period of time until he needed some minor surgery and he was taken off of flight status. So here's the Apollo 8 crew, McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert, and again, they were all set to fly the lunar module in Earth orbit, and they had been spending a lot of time essentially babysitting the lunar module, the first manned lunar module, as it went through testing. And in August '68, the CIA, well, there are 2 things. The lunar module was behind schedule. It wasn't ready to fly when Apollo 8 was ready to fly. But also, the CIA had determined through spy photographs and other means that the Russians were probably going to send a person around the moon in December 1968. And at that point, that was the last thing that the Americans wanted to see, is to have a Soviet beat them to the moon. So George Low, who was the deputy director of the Apollo program, actually came up with this idea that, they'd just flown Apollo 7 for 11 days. A trip to the moon and back is less than 11 days. They could go into orbit around the moon over Christmas in '68. And somehow, with all the risks involved and all the work that had to be done with getting trained and getting the computer software up and getting the tracking systems up, they got this approved. So Apollo 8 was now going to be a lunar mission. This was taken to McDivitt's crew, and Deke Slayton went to McDivitt and said, we want to change your mission. You're not going to fly the lunar module in orbit anymore. We want you to go to the moon. McDivitt said, no thanks. I don't want to do that. We've been spending all our time with the lunar module. We want to fly the lunar module in Earth orbit. So Slayton then went to the Apollo 9 crew, Frank Borman, and said, will you fly Apollo 8 to the moon? And Frank Borman was a real, he was anti-red, anti-communism, anything we can do to stick it to the Soviets kind of guy. So he agreed to do that. So here's a picture of the Apollo 8 crew with Jim Lovell there instead of Mike Collins. But then again, here's our backup crew, Armstrong, Aldrin, and this guy is actually Fred Hayes, who ultimately flew on Apollo 13. So that decision changed things. You have Bourne and Lovell Anders going to the moon on Apollo 8. Their backups are Armstrong, Hayes, and Aldrin. So if you skip 2 missions, the Armstrong crew now suddenly becomes the prime crew for the first lunar landing mission. And that's exactly what happened. Apollo 8 flew to the moon in Christmas 1968. And in January 1969, the prime crew of Armstrong and Aldrin, and instead of Hayes, they put Collins in there because he was back on flight status. So Apollo 9 flew in, McDivitt got his flight of the lunar module in Earth orbit, and that was a D mission. That if you look at the patch, you'll see that they actually colored in the D there to symbolize the D mission. Apollo 10, a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11 flew in May, and we know that Apollo 11 flew in July. So, going back to the question, why was Neil Armstrong chosen to be the first man on the moon? Well, you can thank Jim McDivitt, because he chose not to fly to the moon on Apollo 8, but flew in Earth orbit, and so that flipped the backup crews around, and instead of Pete Conrad being the first man to walk on the moon, we got Neil Armstrong. But even putting Armstrong's crew in the position to fly the G mission, the first landing attempt. You know, anything could have happened during Apollos 9 and 10. If any of those missions had had problems, failed to accomplish their objectives, they could have reflown the F, E, and F missions. And Armstrong and his crew may have flown the Apollo 10 mission or whatever. It might have taken several missions. And the fact that all of these missions were successful such that when Apollo 11 came up, it was the first lunar landing attempt, I think surprised a lot of people. When we look back at it now, they say, okay, no, 7, 8, 9, 10, Apollo 11, you know, these were every 2 months. The pace of these missions was incredible, and each one was successful, which is still impresses me to this day. So Armstrong is now commander of the first landing attempt. Still doesn't mean he's going to be the first one to walk on the moon, because during the Gemini missions, there were spacewalks. Gemini was a series of missions to essentially prepare all the hardware and software and the mission control and the training to get ready for Apollo. And one of the things that they did is they went outside the spacecraft. And during the times that that there was an EVA, extravehicular activity, a spacewalk, it wasn't the commander who went out, it was the pilot. There were 2 people on Gemini. It was always the pilot went out. And this is a picture of Buzz Aldrin on Gemini 12. He did a couple of spacewalks while his commander, Jim Lovell, stayed inside the spacecraft. So here we are in January 1969. The prime crew of Apollo 11 is introduced to the press. There's a big press conference, and someone asks, who's going to be the first man to get outside and walk on the moon? And Armstrong and Aldrin look at each other and, well, we haven't decided that. And they hadn't decided that by then, which is amazing. And, you know, Aldrin put forward the case that, well, during Gemini, it was the pilot that got out first, so I should probably get out first, followed by Armstrong. And he actually went to his dad, who knew some senators, and he went, and some of these senators actually were surprised to hear this guy, you know, sort of vouching for his son, like, hey, my son should be the first guy to walk on the moon. But then there was another issue about getting outside the lunar module first, and that was, it's not very big. And when you're standing inside the lunar module, the door opens a certain way where Armstrong, on his side, it's actually easier for him to get out. And there's been a lot of discussion that, well, you know, Armstrong had to go out first because the door opened that way, and, you know, it just made sense. Well, I don't agree with that argument, and I'll show you why. This is LEM 9. All the LEMs had numbers. Eagle, the Apollo 11 LEM, was LEM 5. LEM 9 was supposed to be the Apollo 15 lunar module, but after Apollo 13, Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. And there were lunar modules actually being built at that time for those missions. But they reached a point where Apollo 15 was supposed to be a repeat of Apollo 14, 2 astronauts, two days on the moon. With only 3 missions left, they moved on to a new series, a J series of lunar module, which carried the lunar rover and had the capability of being on the moon for 3 days. So this lunar module became surplus. So this LEM was all set to fly, but it didn't fly, which is kind of nice because lunar modules, if they fly, they don't end up in a museum because they don't come back. So we do have an actual lunar module in a museum. It was hanging from the ceiling at the Kennedy Space Center until last spring. Now they're going to reset it on the ground and make it into an more interesting display than just this albatross sort of hanging from the ceiling. In the mid-90s, it was actually on the ground, and I was down for a shuttle mission. Actually, it was Mark Garneau's second shuttle mission, and they were just getting ready to move it into the other building. And I was talking to some of the people there, and I said, well, I'm sort of doing some research on the LEM. get up to it and take some pictures and whatever. And when I was there, they said, well, would you like to go in? So let me think about that. So I did have half an hour inside an actual lunar module, and that's the view of the commander's side. So the only thing that's missing is the computer, the diski. Probably flew on another mission. But the interesting thing about the LEM is it is tiny. Very, very tiny. But what about this whole thing about Armstrong and Aldrin and, you know, Armstrong having to go out first? Well, I sat on the Ascent engine cover, and with my right foot I could hold open the hatch. And you could look out there and see the porch and the lunar surface. And it was obvious to me that if Armstrong and Aldrin wanted to just change places before they put their backpacks on, it would have been very easy for Armstrong just to sit here and close, well, the door would have been closed. And Aldrin could have just moved to the other side. So that argument doesn't really hold water, but I believe the story that Armstrong just decided to use the commander's protocol and decide that I will go out first. That's how the decision was made.
I outrank you.
Yeah, he pulled rank. So that's how Armstrong. So even in January 1969, when they decided that Armstrong would be the first out, there's still no guarantee that Apollo 11 would be the one to make the landing. But as we now know, it was the first landing attempt. So let's go back and talk about our friend Owen. Owen Maynard not only was in the planning department, but ultimately he became primarily responsible for the design of the lunar module. And so Owen became essentially the father of the LEM. And there were so many specials and documentaries over the summer, and I was watching one and I saw for an instant during the celebration after splashdown of Apollo 11, I caught a picture, I caught Owen in the mission control there celebrating. Here's a picture of Owen during a U of T convocation where he received an honorary diploma, engineering diploma, and that's his son Ross there, and that's Jim Floyd. So anyone who is familiar with the Avro Arrow will know Jim Floyd as the designer of the Avro Arrow. And there's our president, Chris Gaynor, sort of getting in the photos somehow there. So Owen was a really interesting guy. We would talk for hours on the phone. He actually, after Apollo 12, he went and worked for Raytheon in Massachusetts and ultimately retired here in Waterloo until he passed in 2000. So these guys they're about, as I say, there are about 30 of these Avro Arrow guys, and they did some amazing things. There were people who designed the heat shield for the command module. There's Bruce Aikenhead, who just passed away just a few weeks ago, who was involved with ultimately with the Canadian space program, the development of the arm, and the selection of our astronauts. And again, there's Owen. So Owen was, there were a series of Apollo stamps that Canada Post put out this July, and Owen and another Canadian, James Chamberlain, were recognized on those series of stamps. And actually Chris Gaynor and I were involved with the design and the technical support of that project. So that was kind of a fun thing to do, and it was great to see Owen recognized for what he did. Because he was involved with the evolution of the LEM and the lunar module, the design and the evolution of the LEM over a short period of time is well, it's another story. But the company that designed the LEM, Grumman Aerospace, they came up with this design, which, you know, the Grumman designed aircraft, and you had all these aircraft engineers, and they were asked to design a spacecraft. and you can see a very nice, smooth-edged helicopter-type vehicle there that was never going to fly. But Grumman was chosen because of the way they approached the project and a lot of the way they answered a lot of the questions. They'd really thought about the whole idea of designing and building this spacecraft. But ultimately, the LEM looked like this. And one of the major changes was the refinement of the redesign of the windows. Because this helicopter, this thing actually had seats. And the problem with the lunar module is it got very, very overweight very, very quickly. And they had to cut back a lot of weight on the LEM. And one of the ways they did that was to take out the seats and shrink the windows. And the idea was that instead of having someone sitting back from the window, you could have them standing like they were driving a trolley car. And if their face was right up to the window, then the window wouldn't have to be very big at all. So you'd have a lighter window, you'd have less worry about the pressure within the LEM. And in fact, this is a LEM window that was on a LEM that didn't fly. LEM 13 actually, I think. So you can take a look at that during the break. So Owen had a counterpart at Grumman. His name was Tom Kelly. And these two fellows are considered to be the fathers of the lunar module in its design and test and the process of getting it to the moon. And I had a chance to visit Tom in his home in Long Island in the mid-90s. And these guys had some amazing stories, and the way that they attacked the problem and got all of the problems solved in a very short period of time is an amazing story. So the lunar module looks the way it does because they had to make it lighter, and it is covered with various colored foil and different materials of different colors, just essentially to isolate it from the space environment. The goal, the objective was to keep all of the fuel and other liquids inside the LEM at room temperature. So they employed a series of Kapton plastic film, layers and layers of Kapton film, and various materials to either absorb or reflect heat. This is a painting taken by a friend of mine, Paul Field, who is a Canadian aerospace artist. And he and I go back a while. This is us in a LEM simulator, the one that was down at Kennedy Space Center that all the astronauts trained on before they flew. It was actually moved up to a museum in Long Island, and you can actually see it there. But that simulator has a lot of mileage on it. So one of the things we talked about at the beginning was what changes were made to the LEM when it was sitting on the pad. And remember, the pace of these missions was such that it was every 2 months. The Apollo 11 spacecraft was moved up to the pad during the Apollo 10 mission. That's how quickly things were going. And here is the Apollo 10 lunar module. So that's LEM 4. And there it is flying. And when they got pictures back from the mission, they found that the reaction control engines, and there are 4 clusters of 4 reaction control engines, and they are 100-pound thrust engines that control the attitude of the lunar module. So as the astronaut uses a hand controller, he can pitch the spacecraft up and down, roll it, yaw. And these engines spit out hot gases to make those changes. Well, the 4 engines pointing down impinged gases on the top of the descent stage and actually did damage. And they saw that from the pictures. So they wanted to fix that before the Apollo 11 mission. But the LEM is out on the pad. And here's a picture of a test of one of these reaction control engines. You can see the gas comes out, it's very hot, and it could do a lot of damage. When a lunar module is put in its protective covering here, it's called the spacecraft launch adapter, you'll notice that there's a little hatch door nicely positioned here, strategically positioned in front of the hatch on the LEM, because the spacecraft is sitting on the pad for 2 months. They have to get access to the lunar module to load it with spacesuits, backpacks, film, all these other things. So when the spacecraft is sitting on the pad, they actually moved this mobile service structure up, and it totally encased the spacecraft and gave people access to the various parts of the spacecraft. And then when they were on the pad, they actually put a series of scaffolding all around the lunar module to give the workers total access to every part of it. And that's when they added what they called coal chutes to the lunar module, essentially deflectors underneath the 4 reaction control engines to deflect the gas away from the descent stage. So all these 4 things were actually put on Eagle when it was sitting on the launch pad. That's a picture of a couple of gentlemen putting a plaque on one of the landing gears of one of the later missions with the astronauts' names, but you can get an idea of how they would get access to the various parts of the lunar module. They had to tether everything off, like in all the tools and their watches and everything, because right below them was the oxygen tank for the 3rd stage. So if you dropped your hammer, then you'd delay the mission for probably a good 6 months.
Randy,
Yeah.
those deflector panels, would they not tend to push as the gas came down, and hit this, if it's at an angle, wouldn't it tend to make the whole craft yaw?
That's a very good question. There would be. It's at a pretty oblique angle, but yeah, there would be some result. Yeah, that's a good point. But it probably wouldn't be enough to really affect it as much as just the effect of the gas coming out of the engine. And you notice that every part on a NASA spacecraft has a part number. Also, all of these different materials on the LEM, as I mentioned, are put there for a reason, whether they're pyromark paint or red fiberglass on the ascent stage, or various thicknesses of Kapton or Inconel foil. All of these have a certain purpose. All right, the walkout. Why do I want to talk about the walkout? Well, the interesting thing about the walkout is Michael Collins was carrying a grocery bag on the walkout. And it's right there. And there's a better picture. There he is. So why would Michael Collins, at the beginning of a historic mission, be carrying a grocery bag out to the launch pads? And if you've read his book, you know the answer. But there was a tradition to bring Gunter Wendt, who was the head of the White Room. He was one of the von Braun Germans, and all the astronauts called him the Pad Führer. And every crew brought Gunter a present, probably just to sort of cut the tension a little bit. Gunter prided himself as a prized fisherman. So Michael Collins brought him a trophy trout. So I think you have to ask yourself, here are the astronauts walking out this, they're sort of lumbering out in these big Michelin Man spacesuits or whatever, and they've got these gloves on. What if Collins had dropped it and the plaque had fallen out onto the ground for all the photographers to see? That would have been pretty neat. All right, so we are on our way to the moon. Let's talk a little bit about the landing. When the lunar module's in in lunar orbit at 60 miles, not 60 nautical miles. The process to get on the moon is just to slow down. You have all this velocity in orbit. As you slow down, you will descend. So to get down to a point of 50,000 feet just east of the landing site, they fire the Lunar Module engine for about 30 seconds. And that puts them into this elliptical orbit called a Hohmann transfer orbit. And then at that 50,000 foot point, they're about 250 nautical miles away from where they want to land. They fire their engine, and most of the time, the engine is just pointing in the direction that they're flying. It's so that they will slow down. Most of the process is what they call the braking phase. Then at high gate, all the time they're either looking down, or as they can roll the spacecraft, they're looking straight up. They can't see where they're going. It's only at the final approach phase at high gate where they begin to pitch up a little bit, and the astronaut can actually take their look. And in fact, that's why when you look at the mirror, the window, it's not straight up. It's actually tilted a little bit just to give them a better view of the window as they're pitching over. And then at the landing, at low gate, the astronaut generally takes over. All of this is automatic. The computer is running this. But the LEM didn't know how to avoid boulders. So it was an astronaut that had to do that. On the bottom of the 4 foot pads, there were probes. And you may or may not know that the legs and the support structure were all made in Canada, in a company in Quebec. Not the pads, though, not the landing pads. So even though a lot of people will say we were the first on the moon, I'm afraid not. And not even the probes. So the reason for the 6 foot probes is that you wanted to know when you were coming very close to the surface. And when one of those probes touched the ground, this little blue light up here, about the size of a toonie, would turn on. And at that point, Armstrong was supposed to hit that button, which would essentially kill the engine, and you would drift down the last few feet. The reason they wanted to do that is that they did not want to land with the engine firing, because there's the possibility of the exhaust kicking rocks up into the engine and into the internals of the engine, and that could have caused an explosion. So that's why they had those probes. But someone decided that because when you hit the ground, the probes just bend out of the way and could bend up, they would take off the probe on the front landing gear, because that's where the astronauts were going to be making their first step. And it would be embarrassing if the astronauts' first step was to trip over a landing probe, and one small step. So this is another painting by Paul, and you can see that it was in fact this landing probe that hit first, and there was some velocity this way, such that the probes bent the other way, and you can see that in this photo of 2 of the probes. So they would either collapse underneath the foot pad, or they would bend out of the way. All right, talk a little bit about the moonwalk. His first words, that's one small step for a man. He did forget to say A, but I think we know what he meant. But it is interesting that NASA did not tell him what to say. They left it up to Neil to decide. But if you looked at the video of him coming down the ladder, he had to jump the last 3 feet. And as you can see here, even in a 1 gravity environment, it's kind of difficult to make his way up the ladder. And you may ask, well, why did they not just build the ladder all the way down to the footpad? The reason was the last 3 feet of the landing strut here was made of compressible honeycomb material to absorb a hard landing. And they could actually come in at 10 feet per second vertically and be able to survive. But what would happen would be that all of this would have been compressed and the ladder would actually be down by the footpad.
Wasn't it also that they were concerned about how much dust the lander would be landing in, and they didn't know how much?
Not so much.
Not
After,
much.
after the surveyor missions, they knew that it was going to just sit on the surface. But because the astronauts were so skilled, they greased every landing, and there was no flight where they actually compressed the landing gear at all. So all of the astronauts had to jump. So once Armstrong got down on the footpad with both feet on either side of the footpad, then he just moved both feet to one side of the footpad and moved his left foot out onto the ground. And as you can see with our highly paid astronaut model here, that's what the first steps would have looked like. What's interesting is if you look at the video of Apollo 15, David Scott, after a spacewalk, would come to the footpad and he would jump nearly all the way up to the porch in one jump. They got very used to the one gravity environment.
Giant leap for astronauts.
Very giant leap. So the video, there was actually some pushback on video during the Apollo missions. And at one point there was thought that they wouldn't have lunar surface video during Apollo 11, just because it was just another thing to worry about, and there was concern about doing what they had to do and adding too much to the astronauts' workload. But fortunately, saner heads prevailed, and the black and white camera did fly. It flew on this thing called the Mesa, which is essentially a little trap door that was folded up into the LEM. And then when Armstrong came down the ladder, he pulled a little D-ring, and the Mesa came down, and there's the, it was used for, it stored tools and rock boxes, and it was a work platform that they could use. But that's the way the camera looked. It was upside down, and somebody had a job that they had to flip a switch when the Mesa came down to put the picture right side up, and they forgot to do it. So for the first few seconds, you can see Armstrong come down, but the picture was upside down. And the capsule communicator, Bruce McCandless, said, "Oh, picture looks great, except it's upside down." And then somebody clued in, and they flipped the switch. So there's the camera. Now, it did not send back a signal that was essentially what we're used to. It had a lot less scanning lines, and it only went frame 10 frames per second instead of 30. And at the time of the moonwalk, Australia was pointed at the moon, and so it was their receiver that picked up the video, and they converted it into North American standard, and it went on a landline, it went up a satellite, it went down, it went up to another satellite and down. And through all these conversions, it gave us a real snowy mess. But somebody took a Polaroid off of the screen in Australia, and you can see how much clearer the video was before they converted it into the North American standard. And you may remember about 10 years ago, there was this big search on for the videotapes, the missing videotapes of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. And it was those videotapes they were looking for, the pre-converted ones. But it was determined that those were wiped and reused not long after the mission, unfortunately. So they had one camera for some strange reason. I don't know why, but they had one camera, and the astronauts took turns taking pictures. During the landing, they had a 16mm camera here that looked out the window and filmed the landing. And during Armstrong's first walk, first steps, it captured him taking his first steps. And actually, you can see his gold visor is up there. You can actually see his face. So when Armstrong got down on the surface, Aldrin passed down the camera to him on a kind of a little conveyor belt. And he took his first picture of the moon. And the first picture on the moon's surface is a picture of their garbage bag that they kicked out the door before Armstrong came down. And there you can see one of the probes sticking straight up, so that would have been a hazard if it had been on the front landing gear. That's a nice big hole just in front of the lunar module, but glad they didn't land in. And you can actually see the motion of where the probe struck. So the LEM was definitely moving this way when it landed. And so Armstrong took a picture of Aldrin coming out, and it's a very tight fit. And there he is, ready to jump down the 3 feet to the footpad. And there's another picture of Aldrin setting up a solar wind collector. And there's another picture of Aldrin by the flag. So there are a lot of pictures of Aldrin. And in fact, when Armstrong took this picture of Aldrin standing by the flag, instead of Aldrin going over to him and saying, "Here, give me the camera, I'll take your picture," he turned his back to Armstrong and moved off and did something else for some strange reason. So there was a point where Aldrin took the camera and stood in the shadow of the LEM and just took a series of pictures in a panorama, 360. And so unless Armstrong was trying to get out of the way, he's going to be in one of the pictures, and that's Armstrong working at the Mesa. And that's probably the best Hasselblad picture we have of Armstrong on the surface. Another picture of Aldrin, picture of the LEM, because I like it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The camera, the Hasselblad camera, was it heated?
No.
So
No, it was probably insulated, because out in the sun, it's 250 degrees.
yeah, or 200 degrees below.
Yeah.
and It's chemical photography.
Yeah, yeah. They didn't have any problems. I think if they'd left it out in the sun for a while, they would have had a problem, yeah. But it was a designed Hasselblad for that purpose. So I'm sure they took that into consideration. Armstrong accidentally got into another picture. So there's his backpack. Another nice picture of a footpad. And looking back up at the Earth.
Earthrise.
Yeah, so there is the antenna pointing at the Earth, sending back the TV. That's how they got their TV back.
You know the focal length of the lens they were using?
No. No. I can find it out though for you.
I'd probably be about an 85 millimeter to 100 millimeter.
Yeah, I wouldn't,
So a bit of zoom.
yeah. Did
No,
they have a
They
zoom?
wouldn't have had much of a zoom on a Hasselblad back then.
Yeah, and of course they practiced because it was just mounted on a chest plate, so they had to get used to pointing it in the right direction.
And with the gloves, it'd be hard to use.
Yes, it was definitely adapted for that. Another picture of Aldrin getting the experiments out. Another picture of Aldrin setting up the experiments. That's the retroreflector that they bounce lasers off of McDonald Observatory in Texas. And from that, they are able to determine the distance to the moon at any point in time within a few feet. So they were able to do some experiments with that. And that's a seismometer. And Armstrong took the camera and went to a small crater behind the LEM and just took this picture. So the reason why, the official reason why there aren't a lot of pictures of Armstrong was that they didn't plan it that way. So you can imagine all the public affairs people. There was one roll of film. They come back from the moon. They develop the film. They got all the pictures out. These NASA people are going to release pictures of the first astronauts on the moon. And someone's saying, okay, find a good picture of Armstrong. There wasn't one. Quick thing about the flag. It was stored on the ladder, just behind the ladder on the leg. You may wonder, how does it flap in the vacuum? Of course it wouldn't, so they fashioned a steel rod along the top, just so that it would fall nicely. When that breaks, that's what you get. That's the Apollo 12 flag, and they had a problem with it. All right, let me finish up with a couple of the problems that they had during landing. One of them was bad communications. This antenna that they used for sending back the TV and communications, whatever, that's what they used to send information back during the landing. And that, not only is it voice, but it's telemetry, like how healthy is the lunar module, that kind of thing. And the communications dropped out during the landing. And they determined that it was actually trying to point through part of the lens structure. So some smart person in mission control said, why don't you just roll it 10 degrees this way? Which they did, and that cleared the view for the antenna, and that fixed that problem. But they had a big book of mission rules. And one of the rules before the mission, if anything happened, they'd go to the mission rules and say, if this happens, then do this. You know, it was all decided. And so if there had been bad communications, they would have canceled the landing. Armstrong determined when certain craters should pass by his window. And he determined early on during the process that they were downrange by about a mile. And this was important because downrange it was a little bit more rocky. And that ultimately had an effect on the final landing site. All right, so you've probably heard about the 1201, 1202 program alarms. The computer on the land controlled the landing. And to control the landing, it had to know how high it was, how quickly it was coming down, how quickly it was moving across the lunar surface. And so it had a radar on the base of the lunar module to supply this information. But it didn't have enough memory to keep all this information in one place. It had to swap out information, use it, then swap in information from somewhere else. And it was going through that process. This antenna on the top of the lunar module is the Rendezvous radar antenna. That's what they use when they blast off the moon and they're heading back to link up with the other spacecraft. And that gives them distance and it helps them to link up with the other spacecraft. Astronauts had set the switch for that radar to a setting which was correct in the checklist, but it was the wrong position. And it fed information, useless information, from that radar into the computer during the landing. And that was just enough for it to overload the computer. And that's why they got the alarms. Fortunately, there was a fellow in the back room who had this cheat sheet, and he had all of the various alarm codes, and there's 1201, 1202 there, which is executive overflow. And he was able to, there's mission control, then there are back rooms filled with people who supply information to mission control. He was able to give the go to mission control to continue the landing. But when those two alarm codes came up, there were many people in the mission control that said, that's it, we're aborting. So that guy who gave them the go, he received a distinguished award for that. So this is the DSKY here, and you can see they're in program 64, and you can see the 1202 alarm code coming up here. And so Armstrong, standing where Armstrong is, he was spending a lot of time looking at the alarm codes. And then suddenly he looks out the window and sees West Crater. And he sees that the LEM is actually flying right towards West Crater. So at that point, he takes over manual control. It's about 300 feet. And he starts flying due west at about 90 miles an hour to clear West Crater. And everyone in mission control can see this. But he hasn't said anything. He's not telling everyone what he's doing. They suddenly see that the LEM is flying horizontally at 90 miles an hour. So he clears West Crater, but, and here's a picture from orbit of West Crater, and that's where he ultimately landed. But this uses up extra fuel. And this is a schematic of one of the 4 fuel tanks. There's 2 fuel and 2 oxidizer tanks. And there's a low-level sensor, just like you have in your gasoline tank in your car to tell you when you're nearly out of gas. So at about 5.6% fuel remaining, this thing gets uncovered and it trips something in the lens system such that there's a countdown of 116 seconds to empty. Now you don't want to run out of fuel. You want to reach a point where you come up to what they call the 20-second bingo call. And that was the actual name of it, bingo. So if you listen to the landing, you'll hear Charlie Duke calling out 60 seconds and then 30 seconds. That's how many seconds until bingo, which is the 20 seconds. So the 20 seconds is essentially get out of there or land. That's the information that the pilot had, that Armstrong would have. You've got 20 seconds, either put it on the ground or abort. The problem with this on Apollo 11 is that it was inaccurate. And it was inaccurate because of this. So this is the, sorry about that. So this is the attitude of the lens. So it's nearly horizontal. But this is the horizon. And watch the horizon. This is the front landing gear. That's the front foot pad. So this is the 60mm camera. And just watch this horizon. It should not be moving back and forth. It should be still. That was fuel slosh. And so once a lot of the fuel had been used up, it began to slosh around in the environment that they were in, which was like next to no gravity. And the low fuel sensor uncovered early. And so the countdown towards bingo started a little bit early. So here Armstrong has to take over and fly past West Crater. The design for the landings was they expected the astronauts to be on the ground by the time the low-level sensor was uncovered. So in other words, they expected to land with at least a minute, nearly a minute and a half, or nearly 2 minutes of fuel remaining. But he flew an extra 60 seconds. The low-level sensor was uncovered early. So if you listen to the tape, he lands at about 15 to 20 seconds before the bingo call, which means he had maybe about 40 seconds of fuel left. And that could have potentially aborted the mission. If they had gotten closer to that point, they could have aborted the mission. Afterwards, the analysis was such that he probably had at least a minute of fuel left, but he didn't know it at the time. So on future flights after Apollo 12, because Apollo 12 was practically on the pad by then, they added baffles within the fuel tanks to prevent the sloshing. But just to finish up, I want to talk a little bit about the last 100 feet. Because once you get within 100 feet of the surface, you're really in a dead man zone. There's really no way, you have three options. Either, if you think you're not going to land, you go to maximum thrust on the descent stage to begin to push you up and get some altitude. Because at some point, when it's out of fuel, there is a series of steps that have to be taken to separate the descent stage from the ascent stage. The descent stage falls to the ground. And there's bolts that have to be blown, and there's guillotines in there, that actual guillotines that cut pipes, and fuel pipes and electrical cabling or whatever. And then that ascent engine has to burn, and it has to give you enough thrust to start you moving up. All this time, you're falling, right? Once you drop the descent stage, you are falling. So within 100 feet, there's no way you can abort by dropping the descent stage and igniting the ascent stage. By that time, you've crashed into the surface. So within 100 feet, you really are going to land. And Armstrong was pretty well committed to do that. In fact, he had said that if he thought that he could have survived a drop from 20 to 30 feet and survived. But the interesting thing is, and I went back and checked this the other day, he spent over a minute hovering under 100 feet. And because at that point, most of the fuel is used up, so this is a throttleable engine. It's at very low throttle. He was hardly using gas at all. And he was just wandering around looking for that perfect spot and just being Neil Armstrong, you know, that kind of wishy-washy guy. And he just planted it down there and did a great job. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention.
Based on nothing at all, that Armstrong was the first one out because he was a civilian. That's right.
No, that was no basis.
Okay. I just assumed that NASA was a civilian agency and nearly all of them were military. That, you know, because he was
A civilian. He had resigned his. He was in the Navy.
Okay.
You know, he flew in Korea.
Was he a colonel or something?
Yeah, yeah. But then he was a test pilot. Yeah, but no, it was. As I say, he pulled rank. Yeah.
So I got a question, kind of morbid, I guess, but if they had crashed and were killed, or they couldn't get back up to Collins, right? The command module coming back to Earth, right, had a calculated velocity and weight, right? So with less than 500 or 600 pounds for the two astronauts in the rock, could that had made Collins at risk as well?
No, because if you go back and look at the transcripts before re-entry, Mission Control sends up the weight that they punch into the computer. So they just would have adjusted the weight. Yeah, that is a concern, and they do take that into concern. Yeah. But yeah, he knew how to come home. That would have been pretty.
When they opened the hatch, did they just vent the atmosphere? That they had?
Yes, yeah, they had actually had another vent that through the top hatch to let most of the air out, because that hatch is flimsy. I couldn't believe it. It weighed next to nothing. So you didn't want to start pulling it and bending it to sort of crack the seal, which they actually ultimately had to do. Because the thing is, once their suits are active and their backpacks are out, it's outgassing as well. So you're trying to get a perfect vacuum in the LEM, but your suits are pouring out CO2 and gases as well. So they had trouble actually getting a vacuum. They had to sort of, you know, how you sort of crack a Tupperware thing. That's what they had to do with the hatch.
Because they were 3 days on the moon.
Less than 24 hours.
Oh,
21 hours, yeah.
Wow.
Those guys were just 21 hours.
I didn't realize.
Yeah.
This might be a very ignorant question, but how did they pick the landing site?
That's not ignorant at all. It's a great question. They had a whole team of people, including scientists, to come up with landing sites. The first landing sites were close to the equator because that was the easiest orbit to get into. And then they picked a series of landing sites across the equator because they wanted to land at a site that was flat, you know. They weren't really looking for the interesting sites. The missions later on were more interesting. But they chose a series of them because they wanted to land with, they took off such that they would land when the sun angle was 7 degrees above the eastern horizon. So they chose a series of them because if they missed their first window and had to launch a few days later, that would have pushed their landing site farther west. So that's why they had a series of them. But yeah, but landing site 2, that was chosen. They had some unmanned spacecraft that landed on the moon called Surveyor, and that gave them all the information they needed above the surface. But they chose a nice boring site for Apollo 11. Yes, Court?
Yeah, I had noticed on the last point you made, that when I compared the phase of the moon and the landing site, that it was very close to the terminating. Was that due because of heat? That might have happened later in the lunar day?
No, it was all visibility.
That's all.
That's all. They figured out the 7 degree angle gave them the best visibility.
So that gives you a super long shadow.
Yeah,
That was,
yeah, yeah. And in fact, it was interesting as a lot of the astronauts, even though they had information on their displays, and the other astronaut just had to read out information, altitude. But most of the astronauts, they could see their shadow out there, and they just landed and they brought it in, and they just essentially flew the shadow down to the ground. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.